Good afternoon, everybody. It is Monday afternoon, the 19th of January. I'm Ian Plaid, I'm the peacemonger, and I'm glad to welcome you back to the show and also to welcome Professor Richard Sakwa. He's an Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Canterbury, and actually, where Glenn Deasman was the first podcaster that I met after I left the diplomatic service. Richard was the first actual human that I met after I left the diplomatic service. Following the publication of my book, A Misfit in Moscow, I went across to Canterbury for a very pleasant lunch with Richard when I was kind of wondering what the hell I was doing in this kind of bright glare of a post-government service world, and he's been a good friend ever since. So he's also on the verge of publishing a new book. He's published so many books. This one called The Russo-Ukraine War, The March of Folly, which comes out in March, and perhaps he can tell us a bit more about that. But before we get into that, welcome, Richard.
My great pleasure to be with you.
Now, Richard, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the kind of the legal travails that you went through last year. I know you're not the only person. I know Robert Skidelsky and other people have had the same thing where you were literally arrested at the border at Heathrow coming back to the UK. One assumes because of your controversial views that wars should be ended. Why don't you tell us a bit about that experience
Yeah,
and why you think it happened?
it was a detention rather than an arrest. But as you say, I joined an illustrious, or maybe less than an illustrious, gang or crew, including, of course, famously recently George Galloway and his wife, who was stopped a few months ago on the way to a meeting about China, as it happened. So what happened? I was coming back in June through Heathrow, and a little posse, let's call it that, was waiting for me as I came out from the plane just as you enter the main passageway. And basically, you're called in, and according to the Counter-Terrorism Act of 2019, which is a modification of the 2000 Act, if I'm not mistaken, they can keep you for up to 6 hours. They and basically you're deprived of all rights. You're not allowed to silence. I mean, obviously, if you do want to maintain silence, that will be taken as an indication of guilt and therefore liable to arrest summarily. So a whole stack of warnings were associated with about the terms. Yes, they did offer a lawyer, but this would be the house lawyer rather than anything else. If you wanted to call your own lawyer, as such, it would have taken, we're talking about hours. So, in these 4 hours of questioning, it was clearly just a fishing expedition. Why I was detained, it was later on. They said because I had engaged in media work, interviews, in particular with Russian media, and therefore I would be guilty of disinformation and of spreading fake news and all the rest. It was quite absurd, to be quite honest, because what we're seeing here and elsewhere is the bounds of legitimate debate being narrowed to a point of extreme danger, because I think that I'm a great defender of our constitutional rights, and quite clearly this new law and so many legislators at the time in 2019 under Boris Johnson warned about the effects of such draconian legislation. And of course, the usual term you'd use is that this is a type of McCarthyite suppression of legitimate debate, because in all of this, there was no question of me having engaged in any activity which could be anti-constitutional, illegal, incitement to violence, or anything like this. It was simply because of one's views. And why I've engaged in particular going to Valdai and other meetings is because I believe in dialogue. I believe in engagement. I believe that we do need to keep doors open and lines of communication open. And I think it's a catastrophic mistake of the UK government and other governments to have, and the European Union in particular, in this sort of self-righteous belief that we are the fount of all ethical behavior and morality, and on the other side, only a bunch of demons to be Hitler-light, if not worse, individuals, that any engagement is appeasement, and this very tired language. So in this time, in the 4 hours I was detained, they're allowed to keep you for 6 hours. They confiscated or held, impounded, let's put it this way, my laptop and mobile phone. They took, all the details from the passport. This included, by the way, a full-scale DNA samples, photographs from 8 different angles. So even worse than the 1930s mugshots, which would be front and sideways, but eight photos, fingerprints, not just of the fingers, but of the palm and everything else. In other words, the full works. I mean, outrageous. A person an academic going about their business, in the questioning, quite clearly, that they were just trying to catch one out, actually. And that was the worst thing. I've had experience of this before by other agencies, and you give them a slightest lead, and of course they immediately jump on it and, would interpret any statement in the worst possible light. So you had to be, for those 4 hours, constantly, I had nothing to hide, but on the other hand, open to misinterpretation if you stay. So the bottom line was, why do you go to Russia? Well, the clue is in the name, Professor of Russian Politics. And so I've been doing it for 40 years, and I, intend, hopefully, to continue doing my work, which is to study an important country.
So you were arrested under the Counter-Terrorism Act, and they took swabs. I mean, they took DNA swabs, did they,
Yes.
from inside of your mouth? Good heavens
Yes.
above! And it didn't actually stop there, did it? Because even though you were let back in as a free man into your home country, you suffered further kind of slight restrictions at the border during subsequent journeys. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. So the following journey overseas, when I came back through Heathrow again, the automatic gates didn't work, and it's interesting that the lady on the gates immediately knew it wasn't just a malfunction of the passport, but there must be some sort of special signal. So she immediately said, "Go to no, this isn't going to work. You need to go to the human person at the gates." And fortunately, there was a really that the border service, the lady there was, exceptionally helpful. They couldn't help. Obviously, they couldn't. They're not allowed to let one through if your passport is marked. So they had to. That I was sent very courteously to a detention center, a detention suite, and waited there while they contacted the relevant people in a home office, which I think you've said is SO15, the old special branch. And so I had to wait. So that was, incredibly annoying because you're coming back late at night and you've got a train to catch and this sort of thing. Later on, fortunately, I had the support of a couple of, outstanding lawyers who wrote a very stiff letter because, well, very complicated reasons we won't go into now. And since then, one of the key demands was to ensure that a passport works automatically at the electronic gates. So since then, fortunately, touch wood, it has worked.
How long were you in the detention suite on that occasion?
Well, it took them about 40 minutes
Goodness
while
me.
they were contacting, which wasn't too bad. But as I came out, that same lady who knew I had to catch a train, because as you mentioned, I live in Canterbury, I need to get back to London that evening. She'd actually personally been pursuing it. And at the end, she said, "Well, what's this all about?" I said, I've been writing about these things in the cause of peace to try to de-escalate this violent war fever and the militarist language. And she was from Croatia. And hopefully not to give her away her identity, there's plenty perhaps of anyway, but she was very supportive. She says, "Good luck with your work. That's what we need." So in all of these occasions, one has to understand the human element, even if they're in uniform or the border service, they're doing their job, and mostly very professionally.
Yeah, I mean it's quite shocking, really, that you should be subjected to this. But I applaud you for taking it in such such a good spirit. I actually happen to know the lawyers that you work with because I kind of talked to them on some other issues related to Russia, as well. So I'm glad that you got through. okay, and suffered no further harassment since that time.
But
But
can I just say
yeah,
that the case isn't, this is maybe the case is not closed, in other words. So they are studying, they downloaded everything from the laptop and the mobile, and it came back about a week later. So, and I've got several million files on my laptop. So perhaps somebody has been sitting there working away. Who knows?
goodness me. Well, fingers crossed not, because I mean everything that you write appears to me at least to be kind of moderate. Clearly, it doesn't accord with the government line on the war in Ukraine, and so on. But it would be hard to say that you're an extremist. I mean, you're an academic, as you said, and we've met on more than one occasion. We actually went to Tbilisi together
Mhm.
last year with Glendees and others, and it's incredibly moderate sort of person. So I hope nothing further comes of this, Richard. I really do. But I mean, I worry actually that this is going to get worse. I
Mhm.
mean, I've been out at times, and I have to be honest. I mean, I felt a bit twitchy coming back. Russian media have asked me to do interviews. I've done interviews before. I've just been asked again today to do another one, and I'm questioning in my mind whether I should. And maybe that's the point. They want to prevent people
Mhm.
from talking to Russia, which is a deeply worrying signal because we need to talk. We need to talk to Russia.
Absolutely. And of course, I think that, we who do engage with all media, Russian, US, across the world, we are, uh, in a sense, saving the conscience of United Kingdom in a strange sort of way, because we're not going along with the language of militarism, the warmongering talk, and so on. I love by the way, the title of this very blog, "The Peacemonger," which I think is superb, because that's exactly what we need. And that, of course, is one of the most disturbing aspects of all of this, is just how little societal mobilization there is today for peace. There is the Stop the War Coalition. There are some activities. CND still exists, though nothing like it used to be in the 80s, let alone the 50s and 60s. But the sheer, the absence of alternative media in the UK is disturbing. In the United States, there's a much wider and deeper ecosystem of alternative media, of debates, and so on. But so what we're doing, I mean, you and many others, Glenn Deason, and you mentioned perhaps Alexander McCoy and others, are doing a great job in establishing different lines of communication. You don't have to agree with it, but just keeping open precisely a civic sphere of public debate. And as long as we can do it, as we do, in a civil, normal manner, that's exactly we're upholding those traditions of civility, which unfortunately are being undermined precisely by these anti-disinformation campaigns, which are, of course, a form of disinformation in themselves.
Well, disinformation is actually propagating information that is true and that you know it to be untrue, and that's the thing. I
Mhm.
mean,
Indeed.
what you offer and what I offer and other people are views based on our analysis. Things that we believe to be true based on the evidence before us, and that is not disinformation. That's opinion, and
Exactly.
rooted in analysis. And that's what really worries me. That actually there's a cancellation of thoughts and opinions that don't accord with the government's viewpoint, and that vibrant debate which does exist, including actually in the mainstream media in the United States, doesn't exist in the UK because the mainstream media is totally blocked out by the government narrative, and it is almost impossible to break through it. Although it's been changing very slightly over
Yeah,
the past 6 months, with some commentators expressing concern and question marks about whether we're really doing the right thing by Ukraine and for Ukraine,
indeed.
in the conflict. But nevertheless, in the most regard, there's almost no debate at all in the UK, and that's why channels like these are so important. And thank you for continuing to talk out, as you have.
Yeah. I mean, as you
You know,
say, there's a slight shift, I think, in the atmosphere. Two things, from building what you just said, is that the inability to engage with a sort of alternative ideas and to have a debate means that they go ad hominem. They attack the person rather than the arguments, and that's very disturbing. For example, I'll give you another one. I mean, leaving aside the European case, Jacques Beau, is Ivan Kachanovsky. Now he's a Ukrainian, of course, lives in Canada now. Let's call him a Canadian scholar. He's done some excellent works on the Russo-Ukrainian war. He was the one, for example, who did excellent analysis of the sniper shootings of
Yeah.
February 2014. And this just recently that, as usual, com for example, we've done letters in the Financial Times and the Guardian, maybe seven of us, and about a whole legions, 80 people then respond. And the similar case is now happening which is bizarre, but with Ivan Kachanovsky. And there's an attempt to shut him down. And Ukrainian scholars or scholars of Ukraine are trying to mobilize for the publishers, Routledge, Taylor and Francis, to withdraw his books. Can you believe it? Rather than engaging point by point, where you factually wrong, and Ivan is an excellent scholar, and he would modify it if it was proved, that there was a mistake or a mistaken interpretation. But instead of engaging with his ideas, they want to shut down his work as his scholarly work. So, indeed, that's where he
Yeah.
is.
I mean, Ivan is actually somebody that I want to invite onto this show because, as you say, he's very, very authoritative on his particular subject, and his, really kind of prominent piece of work is, as you say, on the Maidan snipers in
Yeah.
2014, which goes against the Western narrative that Yanukovych ordered his troops to do it. Well, he provides an alternative viewpoint that actually there's evidence to suggest that ultranationalist Ukrainian groups actually were involved, and orchestrated those shootings. So I'd like to talk to him about that. But I mean, of course, in Canada, there's a big expat Ukrainian diaspora population. I know
Yeah.
because they've reached out to me to talk, but never seems to amount to something because that they then immediately realise that my views probably differ, from their own. But I mean, Ivan he's a legitimate academic. He's at the University of Ottawa with our good friend Paul Robinson, of course.
Mm.
I mean, he's a serious guy of Ukrainian descent. He's not some hack who's making stuff up as he goes along. He's researched this, in depth and believes, what he says is true. He's making no money out of his books. I know he's done one of these open source
Yeah.
things for his Maidan book, for example. So I don't think he earns any money from it at all. So yeah, this is
Mm.
deeply, deeply kind of disturbing. I'll try and
Mm.
talk to Ivan soon. And yes, you and I both signed those letters to the Guardian and the FT. And I remember because Laurie Bristow, that my former ambassador in Moscow, was one of the the co-authors of the extremely harsh rebuttals that they sent. But it's
Yeah.
good. I mean,
Yes.
they can send a rebuttal, but we weren't allowed to send a follow-up to the rebuttal.
Yeah.
But there we go.
But
Such is the nature of the media.
it seems very peculiar that why they feel they needed to do that. But well, sure, they can do it. It's a free country still. But there was our little platoon of seven, and they mobilized the legions against us. But the sense that every time we've had a letter published, and all credit to you and Robert Skidelsky, who's been the major organizer, but why do they feel the need that they cannot allow these alternative views to stand unchallenged? And of course, their challenge, in my view, has been very weak, but nevertheless, why they feel they have to do it is a very peculiar very peculiar phenomenon, something rather different even from the first Cold War, where there, so paradoxically, it was a far more, despite some terrible things, McCarthyism, it was a there was the bounds of legitimate debate seem to have been much wider, even at the height of the Cold War, than it is today.
Yeah, it absolutely it is. And actually, on that topic, certainly during the Cold War, I know for a fact that academic exchange continued.
Mm. Yeah.
Between the Soviet Union and Western countries, including, of course, the United Kingdom. There was vibrant debate
Yeah.
between academics on both sides of the fence. But now there's no academic contact at
Yeah.
all. I mean, when I was in Moscow, there were some tremendous university to university linkages
Mm. Yeah.
then. The London School of Economics and the Higher School of Economics had a joint degree program, essentially kind of Russian bachelor's and master's students of international finance and economics
Yeah.
could get LSE accredited degrees by studying in Russia, and then some of them would go on to study in the London School, of Economics, and we'd even have the graduation ceremonies at the ambassador's residence. I used to go every
Okay.
year. It was a tremendous thing.
Can I
You
just
know,
say that on that the University of Kent had a joint master's with a higher school of economics, and our students would then join the LSE cohort for some of the larger English language teaching, and indeed and also School of Slavonic Studies. So in general, yeah, it was a fantastic network, and it has all been demolished now. It was summarily killed, and unlike in the Cold War where these were considered breaches for human understanding. So, this Cold War, if you want to call it that, or this political situation is something far, far worse than before, which means it's how we're going to get out of it will be perhaps even more difficult because getting out of the first Cold War, we had educational exchanges. I took advantage of it. The British Council did a fantastic job. And of course, they had offices not just in Moscow, but St. Petersburg and I think Novosibirsk and some other places. All closed, all gone.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Novosibirsk is a city I know and love. Fantastic opera and ballet theatre there.
Yeah.
Built during World War II when they moved lots of the arts and culture, east, away
Yeah.
from the onrushing, Nazis, of course. And the other thing, of course, is the study of Russia
Yeah.
itself and Russian language. And I think this is a systemic problem to do with the wider difficulties in the tertiary education sector in the UK generally. But Russian language degrees are being shut down left, right, and centre. I'm going to Nottingham University at the end of this week for 2 days. Sorry, talk to students, to give them policy skills for people who are thinking about joining His Majesty's diplomatic service. But they've just found out that all modern language programs have been suspended. They're not taking any new applicants for undergraduate degree programs anymore, and you see this across the country. The University of Central Lancashire, for example. I mean, so many examples. Aberdeen, Sheffield have had difficulties. Cardiff have had difficulties. All across the country, universities are shutting down the study of foreign languages, including the critical ones for us, which are Russian, Mandarin, and Arabic. Our priority difficult languages.
Yeah.
And I remember in the 80s as a kid watching football. I remember there's a famous Tottenham Hotspur football player who was known for having diabetes and also having studied Russian at university. This in the
Mm.
1980s, well, which I thought was a quite remarkable thing for football. I didn't think any of them were that smart, but they're showing my prejudice there slightly.
Mm.
But no, it's deeply, deeply concerning that this is happening. I've got a really good academic friend from. I'm not an academic. I'm a diplomat from St. Petersburg. He's in Oxford at the moment doing a 2 year kind of sabbatical there. I need to kind of catch up with him and maybe have him on this show. But we need to slowly reinstate these links, I think.
Mm.
I see no signs of that happening anytime soon, given the position that this government is taking hard over any dialogue. I mean, in the back of the discussion, laboured and lengthy discussion among the Europeans about whether they should talk to Putin, and if they do talk to
Mm.
Putin, who should talk to Putin. The conversation that's been going on for months. Yvette Cooper came out to say that, well, even if the Europeans talk to Putin, we won't talk to Putin. So, I mean, I
Oh,
see no signs of a change in heart anytime soon. But
mm.
there we are. Shall we talk about your book,
Yep.
the March of Folly? You call it.
Well, it was going to be called the March of Folly, but obviously a reference there to Barbara Tuchman, who did a marvelous book, The Guns of August. But in particular, this March of Folly about how states since the Peloponnesian Wars uh, and all the way to Vietnam have engaged in wars which were ultimately even seen at the time, which many of us do see, pointless, futile, and ultimately with catastrophic consequences. But the title now is the Russo-Ukrainian War. What is it? The Russo-Ukrainian War: Follies of Empire. So the idea
Follies of
was this:
Empire.
the on the one side, there's many arguments, but I'll just maybe give the four levels very briefly, because basically I've been arguing right from the start that, and for many years, by the way, even before all of this began, is the first level is the a conflict within Ukraine itself between different visions and models of statehood and national development. Basically, I've been defending the view of what I called, and this book is dedicated to the other Ukrainians. And by the other Ukrainians, I mean all those tens of thousands, and I've met dozens of them myself, of Ukrainians who believed in a pluralistic, multilingual, multi-confessional, tolerant, pluralistic Ukraine. Basically, what we used to believe were the values of the European Union, but of course that's long gone, as we see in Estonia and Latvia, for example. And so this, what I call a monist vision, dominated, and it's been exclusive. It's a vision based on a misunderstanding of post-colonial argument that, the post-colonial argument is about hybridity, is that you develop, you have to accept this historical situation as it is at the end of engagement between Russia and Ukraine in this case, or even England and Ireland in the past, and so on. So this vision that they have to carve out this almost pure Ukrainian identity by casting out not just decommunization, but also de-Russianization and so on. Anyway, so that's a big topic, but that's the first level, and of course, this prompted the conflicts over the last decade. The second level, of course, is the Russo-Ukrainian level, the bilateral one, where you had people like Zbigniew Brzezinski way back in the 90s and so many more who right from the start, and also it was mentioned just recently in Zubok's magnificent book on collapse, the fall of the Soviet Union, in which the goal was always became the goal, to separate Ukraine and Russia. Because if they were together, according to Brzezinski, they would be, have imperial power. There'd be a powerful combination. And of course, this Russo-Ukrainian level, which I don't go into the book, but something I'd like to explore more, is that, of course, in some ways, the intensity of this conflict and the brutality of it is because these two societies are so close. They're culturally close. They're Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Slavic, linguistically quite close, and of course entwined history for 1,000 years, so highly controversial. And like René Girard would say, this mimetic rivalry is that when twins are close together, you get those rivalry more intense than you would, for example, a serf and the lord are so distant in social terms that they don't refer to each other in the same context, whereas two serfs or two lords are constantly combating. So that relationship was difficult, but it was then exploited by the external. And of course, the United States Embassy in Kiev acted like, from the beginning, as some sort of proconsular authority. Extraordinary, this imperial reach into the heart to make sure that Russia and Ukraine did not get on well together and exploiting constantly any divisions. The third level is one really close to my heart because I've always been a passionate pro-European. By that meaning that we should obviously, Europe should develop, and I sometimes say that I'm the last Gaullist in England, which, but Philippe de Gaulle, I think Charles de Gaulle's grandson, argues that, in fact, there is another Gaullist, and I'm looking, maybe you are this other Gaullist. In other words, this vision that, we should, after the end of the Cold War, have developed a genuine pan-continental, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, common European home, as Gorbachev would put it, a confederation of Europe, as François Mitterrand put it, in the Gaullist tradition. And yet, of course, no, it was defeated by Atlanticism, by NATO, by US-dominated hegemony, that vision of, if you like, call it empire. And they suddenly weren't going to do it. I remember a reception at the Polish embassy a good few years back with 24 European ambassadors, and I was there for some reason. And we went around the table, and I made this statement. And our former ambassador to NATO, not to NATO, to the United Nations, when I said, this vision of pan-continentalism, he said, "Oh, the Gaullist heresy, a heretical thought that we should have a unity from Lisbon to Vladivostok." And that's, again, for 30 years I've been warning this was fatal. It doesn't. I wasn't, this is not an anti-American position. It is a post-American position. Thank you to the United States for all that it has done. And obviously, we want, of course, very good links with the United States. But Europe should take control of its own destiny. And this Ukrainian war is a reflection of our failure to do so. And of course, that's now back on the agenda now, given the breakdown of the political West, the collective West. And so, the fourth and the final level is simply the US-Russian relationship, which, of course, Trump has always wanted rapprochement with Moscow, but he's been blocked by the blob, by the deep state, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, and now the European leaders, or what Putin calls them, the podsvinniki, the piglets. Maybe
Yes,
there's
yes,
nothing.
yes.
Who run off to Washington at every opportunity, or to Davos this week, to block Trump's peace initiatives. I mean, it's just astonishing to allow the slaughter, the murder, and the catastrophe for Ukrainian society to continue.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that provokes several thoughts really, and I want to kind of go through three of them actually on the back of your four themes. The first is this idea of a kind of monist,
Mm.
Ukraine, uh, and my mind flies back to John Mearsheimer's very famous lecture of 10 years ago, 11 years ago, at the University of Chicago, where he brings up on PowerPoint, I assume, a map of Ukraine and
Mhm.
shows the ethnic division, that kind of diagonal line, if you like, that goes through Ukraine between the kind of slight minority of Russian speaking or ethnically Russian a group that were kind of more inclined to vote towards the Yanukovych camp, and the slight majority of the Ukrainian speaking, so Western leaning, people, in the West, in the north, of the country
Mhm.
that in general tended to be more European, and the constant kind of back and forth in as power shifted, between the kind of more European leaning and the kind of more Russian leaning politics of different presidents of Ukraine after independence, was decided. I mean, the idea that there could be a single ethnic, and religious and linguistic identity for Ukraine, to me, it seems to be a complete fallacy.
Yeah, I was in Odessa in May 2014, and we're talking to people there, and I was just, I knew it intellectually, but when you're saying yes, when we go to any interaction with the state, health or education or legal matters or voting and whatever, it's purely in Ukrainian. Russian already by then had been completely destroyed and taken out from civic life, and these babushkas and others were complaining, very upset by it. And it was monolingualism. Now, I understand, and I've always said that in an independent Ukraine, the Ukrainian language should be fostered, should be developed, and should be perhaps incumbent on all Ukrainians to learn Ukrainian. And I think that's fair. Just as in Wales, it's a bilingual society, and all credit to Wales. I think it's fantastic that even I will stop calling the mountain Snowdon now, I've forgotten, Barwiffa or whatever it is called. But, I think that's right. That sort of move is sensible. But to do it like in Canada, you do it, you foster, Ukrainian, but not at the expense and not in such an authoritarian, or totalitarian manner, to be honest. So you're absolutely right. And, in Odessa, that's going to be another big battle over how that's going to develop, because I talking to people, it was quite clear, a huge well of anger, which was then given more political form in the Donbass.
Yeah, of course. I mean, when I first visited Kiev in 2015, and for me it was a slightly more sort of gradual process. I mean, in 2015, Russian was still fairly widely spoken on the streets of Kiev,
Oh yeah.
and I found it in the following kind of 3 and a bit years of visiting Ukraine from working in the British Embassy in Moscow, that you gradually saw it starting to disappear from the lingua franca on the streets, and it was totally eradicated, by the way, amongst the Ukrainian staff in the British Embassy. itself. And
Really?
we were still looking to send people for Russian language immersion training to Odessa, because we
Mm,
couldn't send people to Russia. It's just too complicated with visas, and so on. So it's a more gradual process, and I, to a certain extent, I saw that in Belarus as well. Actually, an increasing
mm,
use of Belarusian, language. But it isn't just the linguistic, is it? I mean, it's also in
mm,
terms of the religious, and actually the political as well. I mean, if you look at the kind of
mm.
the reverence for, sort of neo-Nazi kind of figureheads like Stepan Bandera. I mean, the widespread memorial marches with torches
Yeah.
and red and black flags. Just a couple of weeks ago, on this, what
Oh,
was quite
yes.
chilling.
Birthday. Mm,
What was quite chilling to see that at the time when, when people in Brussels are saying, well, Ukraine is standing up for our freedom and democracy, and you've got neo
yeah.
Nazis not only marching with torches in the streets of but be honored by civic figures in government as well. I mean, I found that quite shocking
Yeah.
that not that it was happening, because I know that's been a problem that represents a fairly small portion of Ukrainian society, just to be clear.
Yeah.
But it's been an issue at least for the past 2 decades, even before the football tournament, the Euros, in
Yeah.
2010. There, but it's the fact that people in the West still cling to this idea that Ukraine is a pure, democratic, free, with no radical ideology at all, as a counterpoint to the hideous other, which is the Russians. I mean,
Yeah.
what's your sense
Yeah.
of that kind of blindness you get, in
Yeah.
Brussels, and also, of course, in London, to
Mm.
this?
Yeah, I mean, two or three things. The first one is that even though there is this linguistic and cultural divisions within Ukraine, and it is, as Putin constantly calls it, an agglomerative state. It's bits were joined to it, Crimea, West, and the Donbass after the civil war. But the one, it's also quite clear that even the Russophone population, opinion poll showed, were committed to the development of a free, open, pluralistic Ukraine. So this linguistic division existed in electoral and other terms, but the commitment to the Ukrainian idea. But then, of course, so that's just to make it absolutely clear. But at the same time, even though the influence of these radical nationalists in electoral terms is minimal, in part, it's because their influence is so profound and it's been adopted by the regime and culturally, and they've been willing to mobilize themselves, Beletsky and others, to use violence, as we know, not only in 2014, but even before that, but certainly afterwards. And so it shifted the whole political popular culture so far to a nationalist populist right, combined with what Vladimir Ishchenko constantly stresses, the radical bourgeoisie, who had a vision of their Europeanness. And so Europeanism became an ideology, gutted of its substantive normative values, the sort of values we've talked about just now, instead of which it's become a way of escaping from Eastern barbarism, all these endless terms they use, Sovoks, Vatniki, Colorados, this very appalling language against Russians and, of course, the Russophone population within Ukraine. So that's the first point, that it was, yeah, that the battle was how we can build a free, democratic, pluralistic, tolerant Ukraine, which it is not at the moment, as you quite rightly say. But this is what this Ukraine we want, and would like to see more recognition of that issue in London and in Brussels, as you say. The second point was that, as you say, the influence of these right wings is far too proportional out of their electoral uh, uh, the actual voting patterns, and the fact that that Zelensky was elected a Russophone and so quickly repudiated the peace platform on which he was elected. So the Russians use the word denazification to describe that. I think that's very badly chosen because it applies the whole system. This is a Nazi society. It is a society with a Nazi problem rather than a Nazi society. Of course, in the bitterness of nearly 4 years of war, a war which is now, as you know, I think last Monday has exceeded in length the Great Patriotic, the Great Fatherland War, which, you know, is catastrophic and soon be exceeding the First World War. The Second World War, from the British perspective, was, I think, what, 5.5 years from 1st of September 1939
Almost
to
six, yeah.
almost six. So, but, you know, this is catastrophic. And so, as you suggest, you know, we need to find a pathway to peace
Yeah.
today, now, and to start at this
Well,
moment.
yes, exactly. And the second thing I was going to touch on, for from the opening remarks, was that this uh, what to pick up on what you said, this idea that Ukraine is, if you want to use that term, an agglomerative state. It was, it is what it is. It has its borders,
Mm,
and so on, as a representation of the kind of uh, post World War One, but also to a certain extent post World War Two kind of settlement, part of the Soviet Union, then independent, yeah, and so on, but still with great complexity within. I mean, in the UK, we have that. I mean, we have North South is very, very different.
mm,
We have, the Welsh and the Scottish and the Northern Irish. In the US, they have the North and the South dating back to their Civil War, and some divisions still exist there. Of course, every country, has its complexity, but it's particularly acute, in Ukraine. But the point is that the idea that there can therefore be a binary choice
yeah,
between having close relations with Russia and having close relations with Europe and the West and the US, has always been a complete fantasy that it
absolutely.
should have to choose. That the best outcome when I arrived in Moscow in July of 2014, and even before that, because I was on Russian language training, when the Maidan, first bubbled up, it was obvious that the best outcome for Ukraine was to have good relations with Europe and with Russia.
Yeah.
Imagine what Ukraine would be today, had it tried to achieve both. And
Yeah.
they're trying to peel away. Has been ultimately devastating for Ukraine itself, at least it seems to me. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. And not only devastating for Ukraine, but actually as a boomerang effect, blowback effect, it's devastating for Europe as a whole. And as we see now with the struggle over Greenland and all the rest, that as the United States goes its own way, well, we won't need to talk about that, but just to say it's now devising a liberal globalism, a post-liberal globalist approach, which is, well, America first, but, exercise of great power. And as an article in today's the American Conservative, this journal, argues that, that Trump is winning bigly. Well, so far, so good. But before that collapse, but the key point is that the European elites put all their wager on Washington. And that has been clearly a losing proposition for at least 30 years. I think that you've argued this as well, that, it's quite clear that, we should have had, there's been endless talk of strategic autonomy, but with, what is it, 20, how many out of NATO countries in the European Union, that there's merger. So Europe, we blame Washington for a lot of this, yes. But the failure of Europe to exercise its agency to, way back at the time, you say when you were there, you saw that Ukraine obviously should have been a, a bridge rather than a barrier with Russia. But the European Union played a very pernicious role as well in all of this in 2013 and 2014, is that when they were talking about signing the association agreement, the thing which sparked the whole effort, the whole thing off for the Maidan, was that, what was it, Barroso and others at the time, actually said, what's Russia got to do with it? As if dismissing 1,000 years of entwined history in its arrogance of the Brussels bureaucrat is almost, mind blowing. What has Russia got to do with it?
Well, they're still
Is
saying it today, Richard. On the issue of NATO membership. What does Russia? What's it got to do with Russia if Ukraine
yes,
joins NATO? Well, Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads,
yes. Well,
and it has security concerns. So please talk to them about it. What Russia has to do with it? I mean, exactly the same things are being trotted out even today.
It's
You know,
interesting about this term, and Putin used it just recently in his discussion with the ambassadors and giving them accreditation. This term, which Russia's legitimate security interests. Now, when I was an associate fellow at Chatham House, we went with the head of the program, Russia Eurasia, to the Ministry of Defense and other meetings. Well, I remember one vividly. So in those days when we were still talking to people, so I went in there and I said, look, if you're negating all this, what's Russia got to do with it? So, in your view, asking this Ministry of Defense official, what are, in your view, are Russia's legitimate security interests? I never got an answer, implying that they don't have any. Again, this sort of negation of Russia, and this is bigger. I'm a classic realist in geopolitical terms, just in both senses, both just realist, pragmatic, and also realist in the IR sense, in terms of restraint and respect for national sovereignty and sovereign internationalism and all of that, rather than liberal globalism. But this total negation of Russia is something very profound, and that, in a sense, we could talk here. And of course, that's opening a whole new can of worms in terms of this conflict. In a deep conflict here is a civilizational conflict. Is that ultimately this cancellation of Russia, the intensity of it, because in a sense, why we could argue why the first Cold War was relatively superficial, the way we've just suggested before, is because it was simply a good old ideological one, communism versus capitalism, easily understood. This one is worse because it's really dealing with perhaps the deepest roots of identity, of civilization, and of culture. Is Russia part of our culture? Is it not? And perhaps it is, but a rather deviant and unpleasant form of it would be the view. Therefore, there's Russophobia, which is, all the way back to the Crimean War and earlier, is emerging again. And this whole phenomenon, I mean, Andrei Tsigankov, an excellent new book called Cancelling Russia, is, in other words, we're engaging with, and that's perhaps one reason why the Second Cold War is so much deeper and it's going to be so much harder to overcome, because it's dealing with the attitudes of the British ruling class, which,
yeah,
still trying to, hate this term, punch above its weight to try to make itself relevant, chasing after the European leaders that we've left now 10 years ago. Oh, the vote was 10 years ago, and so on. So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I certainly see the roots, certainly in the UK, where the Russophobia is, I think, most acute, among European nations, going right back to the great game, of course. I lived in Russia. I mean, it's marvelous, country, great people, but very different,
yes.
culturally, from ours. But my best friends are Thai, and they're also very different culturally from me. But that doesn't stop me having regard to their culture and their worldview and so on. But on that, I mean, I teach strategic policy advice. I'm going to Nottingham University. I said, later this week to talk to some students there about it. And countries decide what are their interests,
Yes.
themselves. It's not for another person to say, well, actually, they're not. But every country has their own strategic interests. And for most countries, they have three that are identical or practically identical. The first is to provide for their security and their territorial integrity. The second is to keep their citizens safe, and the third is to provide economic prosperity for their people. And that's it. I mean, they can be described in different ways, but generally speaking, every country has a variant of that set of core three strategic interests, and Russia is no different. But I don't know. Time's moving on. I don't want to get too deep into a discussion of that. I mean, I wanted finally to touch on briefly this kind of the post-American thing or the globalist, idea, because like you, I mean, when I was in Russia, I said, well, actually, I can imagine one day, driving from London to Moscow. In fact, I did drive from
Mm.
London, from Moscow to London, or to Hampshire when I finished my call all the way back, but without borders. And people say,
Mm.
what the hell are you talking about? I mean,
Yeah.
that's such a crazy idea. And I'd always say to them, well, back in 1989, when Ceausescu was summarily machine gunned with his wife, after his overthrow in Romania, nobody would have thought it was possible to drive without borders to Romania. And I
Mm.
think partly here that there's a kind of there's a failure of imagination.
Yeah.
because when you look at the economic malaise, really, or catastrophe actually that Europe is facing now with deindustrialization, that is in large part due to the fact that we've cut ourselves off from the Russian economy in terms of the availability of cheap energy, which is vital for our industrial success. And people who can't see that actually, Lisbon to Vladivostok is real, not just civilizationally and culturally in terms of opening up and building greater understanding between Europe and Russia itself, but economically, because of the benefits to our economy that accrue from having access to cheap Russian energy, and B, the enormous 150 million marketplace
Oh,
that gives
exactly.
us
I was
for our
just about to say
consumption.
that. Exactly. It's
Yeah,
the largest consumer market by far in Europe, and we've cut ourselves off from that large consumer market. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm with you on the kind of the post-American, I mean, post-American, and the Americans are trying to reset economically with
Indeed.
the Russians, and that's what makes it even more bizarre and clownish that we're
Indeed.
that we're not. And you see people saying, well, it's the Germans' fault for making themselves reliant on cheap energy. Who wouldn't want to be reliant on cheap energy, Richard? I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy
Yeah.
the thinking that people have. So I'm with you. I'm a Gaullist with you. Maybe
You're the
I'm
second
the
goalist. I
Gaullist.
found him at last.
You found the second Gaullist.
Yeah. Yes.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well, I hope there are more of us
Yeah.
around because
Yeah.
goodness, there need to be. But thank you. That is a really, I found that an incredibly stimulating discussion. As always, Richard, whenever we meet, we have fantastic discussions, and you have such depth of knowledge from your research, that far surpasses anything that a journalist diplomat like me could aspire to. So I always learn so much from talking to you. So just thank you so much for everything that you do, and I hope that you don't get imprisoned as a terrorist anytime soon for having these crazy thoughts.
Indeed.
But thank you so much, and just thanks everybody for watching again today. It's been a real delight to talk to Professor Richard Sakwa. And if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe and help me continue to do my work and promote the cause of peace. I wish you all very much peace, and thank you very much, and thank you again, Richard.
My pleasure. Thank you.